Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
We relocated him, living in another Buddhist commune, way up in the bush, up in northern Australia. It was like a massive, great big compound, security cameras, dogs. We went and sat down with him and we said to him, "We've got evidence that says you're Lord Lucan."
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
Where is Lord Lucan?
I am the son of a nanny murdered by Lord Lucan in 1974.
I have a feeling he might be alive.
If he's alive, I was going to find him.
Imagine if you thought you'd eluded justice for that long.
To catch a criminal, you have to think like a criminal.
It can't be him, can it?
An aristocrat on the run. A mystery still unsolved half a century on. In our last episode, we explored the shocking murder of 29-year-old nanny Sandra Rivett, who was bludgeoned to death in 1974 at the London home of John Bingham, more widely known as Lord Lucan. We examined Lucan's mysterious escape, never to be seen again. Well, that's the official story. Today, more than 50 years on, the question still lingers and intrigues. What became of Lord Lucan? Did he die by his own hand, as some believe? Did he live out his days on the run as a fugitive with the help of powerful, wealthy friends? Or is he still alive and evading justice in his 90s? In this episode, we'll follow the global manhunt and examine the many theories about Lucan. From London's Belgrave streets to the far ends of the earth, Lucan's name has kept resurfacing, making new headlines and fueling speculation. Few know this story as well as investigative journalist Glenn Campbell, who's been following the case for decades, much of it with Neil Berriman, Sandra Rivett's son. Their latest journeys, the subject of a 3-part BBC documentary, and a new book has just come out, Lucan, The Search for My Mother's Murderer, by Neil and Glenn. Martin, let's start with a chronology of the sightings and clues over the years, the major developments and official actions in the Lord Lucan case since 1974.
In the immediate aftermath of Lucan going missing, British authorities issued an international arrest warrant and they alerted law enforcement worldwide. There was an extensive manhunt, but as we've explored in the last episode, no confirmed trace was found. Then, in June 1975, a coroner's inquest formally named Lord Lucan as Sandra Rivett's murderer. This effectively made him a fugitive charged with murder.
But by mid-1975, the leads were drying up. Lord Lucan had seemingly vanished into thin air.
Yes, in the late 1970s, new alleged sightings of Lord Lucan began to surface, though none could be verified. Rumours placed him in various parts of Africa, in South America and around Europe, often just hearsay or mistaken identity. The case was effectively in limbo, with occasional media flurries whenever a Lucan sighting story hit the tabloids.
Then, in the early 80s, a new intriguing lead.
It was this. Bob Polkinghorne, a former Met Police detective who worked on the Lucan case, revealed that a credible witness had reported a Lucan sighting in Africa. According to Polkinghorne, the witness saw one of Lucan's close associates on a bridge in Mozambique, and shortly afterwards a second man joined him, a man the witness was adamant was Lord Lucan. Polkinghorne said he sought permission to pursue this lead internationally, but claims his superiors ordered him to stop the inquiry. It was a stunning allegation, if true, suggesting pressure from above to ignore potentially valuable leads.
Glenn, we've got to wade in there straight away. It's lovely to have you with us again, but Bob Polkinghorne, tell us more.
A lovely, lovely man. I remember going to knock on his door down in Croydon. He lived in Croydon. He'd been in the Metropolitan Police. His brother had been in the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard. Both of them had served their 30 years. And he was a straight man, Bob Polkinghorne. When you go on the Lucan story, you meet people and you think, well, are they having a bit of fun with me? Because let's face it, Lucan, Shergar, it's one of those things that constantly as a journalist you have to raise your eyes and think, is someone having a bit of fun with me? Bob Polkinghorne was absolutely as straight as they come. And he invited me in. I remember, because I walked in his door and he grew chili plants. He was retired, had left Scotland Yard, and he said, it's just something for me to do, because he's a detective and he's used to detecting. And often when they retire after their 30 years, they don't know what to do because they've spent their time doing detecting. And we sat down and we talked for about 4 hours in his front room, and he briefly held, or as he said briefly, the docket. And the docket, as Martin would know, is the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer. And he had been given the Lucan case along with a lot of others whilst he was at Scotland Yard, and he held it for about 4 years. But that 4 years that he held it, there weren't many other big murders. And he found he had time to do what he called a cursory review. What he did was he called up the papers. And that's the first alarm bell. And I remember Bob very well because he gave me this, which made me laugh. It was the last ever cheque that Lord Lucan wrote. And he passed this to me. I'll hand it over to you there. The Midland Bank, £500, the Earl of Lucan. That's the last cheque. Bob gave me that because he wanted to prove that he was telling the truth. He didn't need to because he had a great reputation. But as you can see, it's a cheque for £500. And when you look at the date, 1974, just before the murder and his disappearance. I took Bob seriously, and that helped. And he explained to me how the first alarm bell was that he called all the paperwork up and they couldn't find it. They couldn't find the evidence. And I said, what do you mean you couldn't find the evidence? And he said, well, we moved to a depository out at Hendon, but then the training school needed the storerooms. And so it went somewhere else, and I don't know where. I'm trying to find the boxes. And about 6 months later, he gave me a call, and he said, we found the rest. And what he did was he brought it all together. But what he also did, Bob being Bob, is he activated something called CHIS. And he obviously found a little bit of money in his budget. And a CHIS is Martin will know this, covert human intelligence source.
A snout.
A snout. Or someone on the ground, in the know. And CHISs are difficult. Normally you've got to handle them. The protocol is you have at least 2 people to handle a CHIS to make sure that the system doesn't get corrupted. But Bob had intelligence that was coming into him from people in Africa who I now know to be ex-Metropolitan Police officers themselves, who were working out there in various private security industries. And a little bit of an old boys informal network had sprung up where off the agenda they decided to try and find Lucan because they were pissed off that he'd got away with it. And this is very classic with Scotland Yard. You have the above board and you have things get done below board. And Bob Polkinghorne was part of an informal network and he was starting to put together this intelligence picture. But just at the moment, as always happens in this story, that he was beginning to make progress, he got pulled and put onto another crime squad. The docket that was in his grasp was taken away. And I think that's why he then started talking to the media. Certainly he spoke to me. He spoke to one other journalist as well where this story came out. He decided to put his head above the parapet and say, look, I had good intel and I was closed down. And his story was backed up by, we found 2 other detectives who we went to and who backed up his story.
You said he spoke to another journalist. I don't know if it's the same one I'm going to mention now, Chester Stern, who was the former head of the press bureau, the press office at Scotland Yard, became the Mail on Sunday's crime reporter. Very, very well-connected guy because of his former life at the Met. I remember him telling me that somewhere in Africa, he was in a hotel room where he took a phone call from a man who promised to call him back the next day and take him to, not to meet Lord Lucan, but to show him where Lord Lucan was. Of course, that phone call the next day never happened. Chester always used to boast that he came closer to finding Lord Lucan than any other reporter. I'm sure you will dispute that. But tell us, Glenn, about the Africa link and how it deepened with a development that was kept secret until decades later. A development that took place around 79, 81.
79, 81, with Chester Stern. We had lunch about 18 months ago, and Chester, who has now retired, and who has done the most work, the most serious journalism, the best journalism, he sat down with me, and with a twinkle in his eye, he looked at me and he said, "You carry on." He said, "And if you find someone to carry on your work, you pass it on too." So it's like a relay race. And then Chester opened this diary and he showed me, do you know the John Hardy diary? The entry in the diary?
No. Fill us in.
This is fascinating. Chester Stern has a diary, a small black diary, and it's a diary owned by a former Guards officer called John Hardy. John Hardy was tragically killed in a car accident up in Colchester, and I think 1987. When the road traffic police turned up, they found the body and the car mangled, and they thought, we've got to find out who this guy is. So they opened his breast pocket, and this little address book was in there. And they opened the address book, saw John Hardy's name, but 7 pages in is the name Richard John Bingham, Lord Lucan, care of Hotel Les Ambassadeurs, Mozambique. And that diary, in a dead man's breast pocket, found its way to Scotland Yard and then to Chester Stern. Solid evidence. And of course, who was a Guards officer with Hardy? One Lord Lucan. So Chester Stern is undoubtedly, in my mind, if you like, the hero for me journalistically of this story. And he and his work has been the foundation of a lot of the progress that Neil Berriman and I have made, certainly with Africa. And in 1979, 1981, the whole opening up of intelligence with regards Lucan's footprints, very light as they may be, across Africa. And we start seeing evidence coming in. We also see the evidence that came to us from a woman called Shirley Roby, who worked incredibly closely with John Aspinall and who was in the casino business and who was in the office at a casino run by Aspinall and Goldsmith, in which vital information came forward regarding Lucan wanting to see his children from afar in Africa. And the years that we're talking about are the years you mentioned, Martin, 1979 and 1981.
I'm glad I gave Chester a plug, because he certainly was, amongst us all, the man with perhaps the best contacts, up to a point. You may have overtaken him in your work since.
Not yet, although I aspire, but I don't think I'll ever overtake Chester's work because, for 2 reasons, brilliant forensic mind as a journalist, but he also worked inside Scotland Yard for so long, so he knew what was going on. So he walked in both worlds.
Shirley Roby was quite fascinating contact for you. She told you that she'd twice arranged for Lucan's 2 eldest children to travel to Africa on safari holidays in places like Kenya during 1979 and 1981. What did she actually say about that? And did he actually speak to them, or was he just observing his children?
Well, Shirley Roby got in touch with us but didn't want to talk to us. So I'd done a story about Lord Lucan having some plastic surgery done on his face. Now, this sounds mad, but it's true. We'd been sent some medical records in the post from Australia, of all places, an eminent plastic surgeon who'd recreated the faces of Second World War airmen who'd been burnt in Spitfire crashes, had passed away, and he'd left a box of papers to his daughter. In the box of papers were medical records for one Richard John Bingham, Lord Lucan. She knew that I'd done a story on Lucan, so she just posted them to me. Now, obviously, I got incredibly excited because I thought Lord Lucan plastic surgery, but the operations at the hospital in Sussex were in 1960s, pre-Lucan's disappearance. He'd smashed his face up in a powerboat race in the Solent, and the plastic surgery reconstructed his nose, took a bit of bone out, put it in his nose, and they were the medical records. But I'd done a story on the BBC. It went out. It was at the birth of the internet then. Web pages were just beginning for news organisations. Shirley Roby had been sat at home on her computer and had seen the Lord Lucan story in my name. And she wrote to me an email just saying, I don't want to talk to you. I just want you to help me get in touch with Lord Lucan's son because I want to talk to him about something. Now, for me, I thought, well, I can be a conduit and help her, but I'm fascinated. What does she want to talk to Lord Lucan's son about? And so I said I'd get in touch with George Bingham, who I knew, and would pass on her number. 6 months passed. She came back to me. He's not wanting to talk to me. He's not interested in what I have to say. Doesn't even want to talk to me on the phone. And I said, well, I'll talk to you. And it's at this point that her story came just gushing out, that she was a young croupier in London in the 1970s and 80s. She was in her very early 20s. She was working for John Aspinall. She loved animal welfare. That's why she went to work for him. She worked in his casino and made her way up the greasy pole and ended up in the management office. And it's at this point she says that my job once a week would be to turn away this woman who'd turn up downstairs at the casino screaming, I want to see my husband, I want to see John. And I said, well, who was that woman? And she went, it was Veronica. Veronica would turn up and my job would be to gently put an arm round her, take her for a brandy and walk her back home to Knightsbridge. And it's at that point that she said she became more trusted within the tiny cabal of the senior management suite at the casino, which really was Jimmy Goldsmith, Sir James Goldsmith, who bankrolled the casino, and John Aspinall, and a couple of fixers that he had in the casino business, security managers. And Shirley would sit up there in the office, and she said it took about 8 months and several visits down to Howlett Zoo, where I'd helped John with his animal welfare, before he took me to one side and said, I have an old friend who can't come back home, but lives in Africa, and he'd like to see his children. And can you help me help him see his children? And she said, well, I didn't think anything of it. I hadn't done an internet search on Lord Lucan. I didn't know who the mad lady was downstairs who's screaming, I want to see my husband, I know John's up there. I didn't put two and two together. I just thought this was John wanting to help a friend who'd gone through an awful divorce. That's her story. And she then went into detail and went on a documentary we made where we didn't show her face. We slightly changed her voice and we put the documentary out. And then 2 weeks later, she did a front page with the Daily Telegraph, where I think they paid her some money, which is up to her. If the BBC doesn't pay money for interviews, the Telegraph might have done, but she appeared full-faced on the newspaper on a front page. And has since told me, because we're still friends, that she regrets that a bit because she had her anonymity on the BBC documentary.
What's the headline?
I helped Lord Lucan live a life abroad. There she is. There's the article. And she is very, very believable. And I'm still in touch with her now. There's more details have come out. She has always kept her story consistent throughout. She's in the BBC recent documentary too. And I think that effectively she's a really important building block. The thing that makes me really believe Shirley is that I said, well, can you offer other people who might have been in the know? Is there anyone else who can back up your story? And I'm not doing it to undermine you. And she said, yes, I can help you. She goes, one of the goons, one of the men, the Mr. Fix-It in the casino, had passed away, but his wife was still alive. And Shirley offered to give me her name and address. She lived out in the countryside in a very nice house in Buckinghamshire. And I went to see this lady who was elderly, and she confirmed everything that Shirley had told me with more, saying that it was almost like an open secret within that casino and John Aspinall's close circle of friends that Lucky had got away and was being looked after in Africa. He'd even remarried.
By the 1990s, Glenn, Lord Lucan had been missing for over a decade and a half, and there were some legal developments. What were those?
As with anyone who just vanishes off the face of the earth, they leave behind a life, and they leave behind a family, and they leave behind inheritance, trusts. Now, this family had roots that went not just into the aristocracy here, but over in Ireland. Large amounts of property, stud farms, huge acreage in Ireland of tenant farmers. So there was a lot that suddenly had been just thrown up in the air, Martin, and it needed sorting out. And then, of course, you also had the 8th Earl. You had the title. What was going to happen to it? And so moves begun, and Camilla Bingham is a KC, a King's Counsel, eminent barrister. Her husband, Mr. Block, is himself an eminent barrister. So the legal expertise is there, and there began a process to try and have Lord Lucan officially declared dead. In December of 1999, in the High Court, a formal declaration that Richard John Bingham, Lord Lucan, was deceased begun. This was just to settle the legal estate, really, for the children. 3 children, all now adults. And of course, there was also this question mark of would George, because he's the son, the boy, become the 8th Earl? But it wasn't going to happen that quickly because there's a really simple thing that they needed. You need a body. And crucially, there was no absolute proof of death. And quite frankly, the work that Neil Berriman was doing, the stories that Shirley Roby was telling, the story of Lord Lucan's brothers, Hugh Bingham's, my brother's alive and living in Africa, or at least got away, these weren't helping the case. And poor old Scotland Yard were caught right in the middle. What are they going to do? Well, they really just wanted it to go away. And so what they did was, and I don't blame them, they said, well, hang on, we've got other cases that carry priority. This had happened in 1974. We've given it a good crack. It'll always be open whenever you ring them up. They say the case is open, we can't talk about it. Kind of helps them that they can't talk about it in a way. But yeah, that's what happened in 1999.
And then there was a resurgence of interest in the Lucan mystery around the turn of the millennium, wasn't there?
There was, and that's down to John Aspinall having a bit of fun. John Aspinall gave an interview to a very good journalist called Lynn Barber, and she'd gone to interview him. And he really wanted to talk about animal welfare and environmentalism and how we're destroying the planet. But she asked him about the Lucan story. And he kind of let something slip. And what he did was he sort of intimated that Lucan was still alive. He said, if he was a friend of mine and he was one of my best friends, I would do anything he asked. Anything. And Aspinall tried to backtrack later, but the interview went out in the Sunday Times newspaper, I think. And it really was what it was, that Aspinall knew more and had maybe slipped up. And it caused a bit of a furore for a bit. But what that did was it opened Pandora's box again. And crucially, at that particular time, at the turning of the millennium, the internet took off. Suddenly, the world became a global village. Everyone everywhere could take a photo on their phone. It was pre-facial recognition, of course, but we all linked up. And I started getting emails from Africa, Canada, South America. Stuff started coming into the BBC that started to overwhelm us. As opposed to a letter or a postcard, you'd get this man, we've always wondered who he is. He's a posh Englishman who lives on a small island near Sri Lanka. Chester Stern would have had a field day. But by 2000, this story had become turbocharged.
And then, of course, there was a fresh look by the Met Police, a cold case review of the Lucan file. I think that was 2004, wasn't it?
You're right. It's called the Scoping Review. 2002 was when it started to actually get rolling. It was properly published in 2004. When I say published, internally only, stamped with secret all across the top.
I thought you were just about to pull one out of your bag, actually.
No, we have got a copy.
We have got a copy. Why does that not surprise me?
We've got a copy. And the scoping report really is 2000, it gets turbocharged. 2002, the scoping report brings together all the new intelligence, Chester Stern's work in Africa, more information that's leaking in from organised crime. Never a reward. I always find that interesting. Never a reward put up for this one. There's a lot of cases where if you'd have put £1 million up, I think you'd have got a lot more because criminals talk for money.
You'd have got a lot of time wasters as well.
You're right, Martin. You would have got a lot of time wasters, but money does talk. But let's face it, John Aspinall or Goldsmith are never going to put a reward up, are they? They don't want the answer. But yeah, by 2000, turbocharged, and the police scoping report has now really opened Pandora's box. You read it, he's alive.
Then in 2012, you broadcast your findings on the BBC's Inside Out London programme. Shirley Roby's testimony about the African safaris with Lucan's children, and Bob Polkinghorne's revelations about blocked leads. What impact did that have?
It started, Martin, the process of pulling the threads together. So what we hadn't done or no one had done beforehand, and this, I can't even say we came up with the idea. This was from 2 or 3 former SIOs who'd been in charge of the docket, who'd all retired. They all said, pull it all together and put it out there. And so we took their advice. We had experts on hand and we pulled together all the strands, everybody who was an eyewitness, all the statements. We even had one of the senior detectives' daughters call us to her house and said, Dad's left 6 boxes up in the loft. Buster Gehring's daughter, Davina, contacted us, said, they're yours. She gifted them to Neil Berriman. She said, if it was my mum, I'd want them. you have them. So people's generosity here started to overwhelm us, and we began to pull everything together. And the BBC, to their credit, gave us the airtime. And the airtime, an editor behind you supporting you, is all important. We did a lot of filming ourselves. We travelled on EasyJet or Ryanair.
Should hope so.
We weren't maybe lauding it, but we managed to get places. And that began bringing together this body of evidence. And one of the people who came out here, another crucial eyewitness, was Mandy Parks. Now, Amanda Parks, and she'll hate me for saying that, it was a 14-year-old schoolgirl in 1974 who lived down in Uckfield and who occasionally babysat for Susan Maxwell Scott, who had about 5 children. Susan Maxwell Scott and her husband Ian liked the good life. They were wealthy. They were Lucan's closest friends. They were often up in town gambling. Someone had to look after the kids. And for a couple of bob, Mandy Parks would go round there and she'd sleep over at the house. And she used to love it because her mum and dad were farmers, tenant farmers. She could walk there, and she said they always had a wonderful metal tin of the best boiled sweets. And she'd put her hand in, and all she had to do was make sure the children all went to bed. The next morning, Susan Maxwell Scott and her husband would turn up in their glad rags from London, and Mandy would get her 2 bob and go home. 3 days after Lucan disappears, remember, he vanishes into the night just after midnight on the 8th of November. 3 days later, the news has still not come out that he'd gone to Grants Hill House, that he'd gone to Uckfield. And Mandy is asked to come and babysit. And she turns up at the house and she thinks, oh, they're actually staying home this time because there's a party going on, or so there's cars everywhere, very posh cars, and lots of expensive leather luggage in this huge, great big reception hallway as she walks in. And she's quite clear. She says, I used to walk into the house. Right would be where the normal nanny, Monday to Friday, would be, and the kids. Left is the private quarters of Susan Maxwell Scott and her husband. Big, rambling old country house. She said, for unusual reason, I'm guided in to the left. I walk over all this expensive luggage, and there's about 8 people in an anteroom drinking cocktails. Incredibly posh London people, as she called them. And she said, I'm briefly given a conversation with Susan Maxwell Scott, who's had a few drinks, and I'm told, look after the kids, we're going to be here, but we don't want to be bothered. And she goes, in the room, I glance around and I see a man who I now believe to be Richard John Bingham, Lord Lucan, surrounded by friends. And she's adamant that that's what she saw. She then goes off, does her night's babysitting. A day later, she's at home, and a big Bristol motor car pulls up outside, and Susan Maxwell Scott comes in, knocks on the door. Mandy answers. She says, I'm not here to see you, Mandy. I want to talk to your parents. Goes into a room and has a conversation with Mandy's parents, who are both farm workers, and hands them a letter. And the letter says, you need to tell your daughter she did not see what she saw the night before. I don't want her talking. No village gossip, please. Look forward to her babysitting again at some point. And that letter was passed to Scotland Yard. And Mandy is adamant to this day that it was Richard John Bingham, Lord Lucan, that she saw 3 days after his disappearance in the house at Grants Hill House. Another eyewitness. She could have got it wrong. She admits herself that maybe I got it wrong. But why the letter? Why the letter threatening her parents from the big barrister in London? Your daughter did not see what she saw. For me, that's the damning bit.
And in another significant development, you spent some time with Veronica, Lady Lucan, the Countess of Lucan. Have I got that right?
So Veronica, the first thing she did was tell me off for calling her Lady Lucan. Campbell. She called me Campbell. So she was very old school. Not Mr. Campbell, it was Campbell. But she said, I would have thought you'd have looked at Debrett's. I am the Countess of Lucan. She had mood swings. So Veronica was a tortured soul. She was from a middle-class background, but married money. She got what she wanted, the green card into the aristocracy. It did kill her in the end. She took her own life, but she was hot and cold. 1 minute she'd be, he got away, I know he's living abroad. The next minute she would be, he died, he threw himself into the sea and did the honourable thing. I think the way that, to sum up Veronica, Lady Lucan, I say that for fun really, Veronica, if you're upstairs.
She'll be very cross with you, Campbell.
She will, she'll be looking down. The way to sum her up is that her Grace and Favour flat in London was secretly paid for the whole of the rest of her life, decade after decade after decade, for one of her husband's friends and very wealthy benefactors. So she had to toe the line, but there were days where she just couldn't swallow it.
I'm very impressed you got to talk to her, because over the years I've knocked on her door countless times and got no answer. And then I think I spotted her in the street one day and approached her, and there was still no interest in her talking to me. So that's as far as I got. You got to talk to her and just added to the amazing amount of research that you've done. Let's go on with the story. In 2016, there were changes to British law. Lucan's family applied for a death certificate under the Presumption of Death Act. What happened from there on?
The 2016 chapter. If Neil was here, Neil Berriman now, he would tell you about the twists and turns of that. So I was working at the time for a programme called Panorama at the BBC, and I was busy doing stuff, and I couldn't get to the High Court. I couldn't help Neil prepare. He'd spotted that it was coming up in the High Court in a tiny little advert in what's called the London Gazette, because if you're going to have a declaration of death movement in the High Court, you've got to advertise it in case someone's got evidence or is going to oppose it.
Even if it's a very small entry in a very obscure publication.
Absolutely, that's what they did. So George Bingham took this tiny advert out, as he had to, and Neil spotted it, as is Neil. He's a builder from Hampshire, but he's got eagle eyes. And he rang me and said, they're going for death, but they haven't got a body, Glenn, and we know he's alive. And I said, well, look, we need to prepare. And I helped him behind the scenes, but I was busy doing other programmes. And Neil said, well, what shall I do? I said, well, look, write a speech. And what we can do first is you get you as an interested party at the High Court. So he logged himself as an interested party with an hour to go before the deadline. A very nice lady at the High Court took his application by phone and accepted him, which was quite unusual. So once you're an interested party, he's in. There were 2 hearings, but Neil wanted to use the secret report. And we couldn't let him use the secret report in court because it would burn the source. And when you've got someone who's put their life on the line, they've got a pension, they've got a career, that's our game, Martin, that you don't burn someone. So I said, look, we can refer to it, but we can't use it. And he understood it. Neil got it. He wants justice for his mum, but he wasn't going to jeopardise that police officer's life or career. Anyway, on the day at the first hearing, he turned up and an arm appeared around his shoulder, and it was George Bingham and Camilla and her husband. They said, why don't we go for a chat at our chambers? You know, let's talk all together. We're all victims in this, aren't we? And to an extent, they're right. They've lost a father, he's lost a mother. So they went for a meeting at the legal chambers, and Neil said he wished he'd had his own legal representative, but he didn't. And they discussed and had a conversation about how it would go. And the emails and the conversations between are very polite. Camilla's there saying, look, we want you to get resolution 2, but this is our daddy. She calls him daddy. We believe he's dead. Got no evidence, but let's face it, nothing's happened and we need closure. We all need closure, don't we? So a little bit of a number was done on Neil, and then the date came up for the actual hearing. He goes into court, and he does stand up in court, and he says there is evidence that exists that Scotland Yard are aware of that indicates that Lord Lucan is still alive. And the judge, the female judge, said, well, what evidence? And of course, that's the crucial moment, Martin, and he couldn't deliver it. He said, well, I've seen a report. And she went, right, OK, well, can you give me the report? And it was an ongoing case. It's not like a Crown Court case that's 6 weeks. It's going to start and finish on that particular day. She adjourned. An hour later, she came back and declared that Lord Lucan was officially declared dead. Neil went outside, and you can watch it on YouTube, George Bingham, the new 8th Earl of Lucan, addresses the press saying how glad he is now that all this is over and that we can stop looking for Lord Lucan. And then you see Neil Berriman address the press, the world's press, saying that he believes there's much more to come out, and there is. But it was a seminal moment, and it made us both angry. And sometimes anger drives good journalism.
Court this morning declared Richard John Bingham, my father, known to most people as Lord Lucan, as to be dead for all legal purposes from 1981. This does not mean that he or any other person can be will escape prosecution for the murder of Sandra Rivett in 1974, should the police wish to raise a prosecution. I want to take this time to applaud the efforts of Mr. Neil Berriman, to secure justice for his mother, our beloved family nanny, we extend our sympathy to him and his broader family. That sympathy is well grounded in that neither their family nor our family know at whose hand this unfortunate lovely lady died in 1974. Over and above that, our family has no idea how our own father, or my father, met his own end, whether he did so at his own hand or the hand of others on that fateful evening. It's a mystery, and it may well remain that way forever.
And it continued to drive good journalism. Just for the timeline, Veronica, the Dowager Countess of Lucan, died at the age of 80 in September 2017. I think she had the last laugh in a way to the Lucan family because she left her estate to the homeless charity Shelter, which I think suggests something perhaps of her attitude to the family. But in the early 2020s, as the 50-year anniversary of the crime approached, interest yet again surged, and your series and investigation with Neil threw up an Australian theory. Tell us more about that.
It was the High Court and that speech he did on the steps to the world's media that bizarrely unleashed the next bit of evidence. So Neil stands on the High Court steps and says that he believes there's been a miscarriage of justice, says that there's a cover-up. And over in Australia, in Perth, Western Australia, which is the most isolated city in the world purely because of its geographical location, is a man sat in a house with a veranda who's watching it. And he watches this and thinks, that looks like a bloke who I knew 10 years ago, who was here in Perth, Western Australia. And this man, Stephen, sends a parcel, DHL in the post, to Neil Berriman, who he locates through his address because he's a builder and has a website by now. And this parcel arrives, and Neil Berriman gets a knock and thinks, well, I haven't ordered anything here. I order stuff to my depot if I'm doing building materials. Well, what's a DHL parcel doing here? Opens the parcel and out falls all this evidence, maps with very rudimentary facial recognition done by hand. Stephen, in Australia, is a mining engineer whose job was to fly over the mountains looking for topographical geological fault lines for potential indications of iron ore minerals. And so he operates in this kind of bizarre way where everything's done on maps and lines. And in the box are these photos. And you see a man who is an elderly man, but in his 70s, with distinguished features, with a moustache. And then you see Lucan's press photos, the original ones from when he was in the 1970s. And they look similar. They don't look identical, but they look similar. But the story going with it, written down by Stephen, is that I saw you on television here in Australia, on the steps of the High Court. There was a man in Perth 10 years ago who's since disappeared, who lived here for a couple of years, who spoke with an aristocratic accent, claims he can never go back to London, says he was from Belgravia, and says that he'd love to see his children again but can't. And there were other bits of information, but I looked at it and thought, this is just too good to be true. It's just too good to be true. But the timing. And there began the next chapter.
So did you go and meet him? And if you did, what was it like?
So Neil, by now, was running that strand. I was still working very much on what Hugh Bingham had told us in Africa. Between us, I can't really say that here, but between us, you say that a lot in this story, my view was that this was a rabbit hole. It was a false lead, and I wanted to concentrate on Hugh Bingham's evidence in Africa. Neil wanted to go this way. And so we agreed to disagree, and that he was going to spend his time cultivating this man in Australia, and I would carry on with my work. Very soon, within 6 months, the additional information that had come back from Australia had piqued my interest. There's one particular bit of information that got me interested and got me across the line. And that is that Hugh Bingham, when I last saw him in London before he died, had said to me that, I said, well, does your brother still drink pink gin? And I did all the classics, if you like. And he said, no. He said, we're quite a spiritual family. When we grew up as kids, our mum was very spiritual. And my brother actually discovered a new faith system. He became in tune with nature and the principles of Buddhism. Now I thought, well, really, come on, Lord Lucan in a flowing robe in Africa doing yoga. I parked it in the back of my mind. Separately, this man in Australia said that he'd met this man who looks like Lord Lucan at a Buddhist retreat. It sounds ridiculous, but the fact that you've got two separate bits of information with a sterile corridor, they didn't know each other, popping up with more than 7 years apart, that's what got me on a plane, Martin.
And you did come face to face with a man who could be Lord Lucan and who I believe Neil perhaps thinks more than you is Lord Lucan.
As if this story could do with any more twists and turns. So we went to Australia, we met the eyewitness, we grounded out all of his evidence. He was okay, he wasn't flaky, but he certainly had enjoyed recreational drugs, let's say, which is a big scene in Western Australia, or certainly that community. And that worried me a bit. But we then flew across the other side of the country, 5 hours to Brisbane, and we did what I call a number, which is we had the kit. I'd had it personally from the work I'd been doing at Panorama and stuff, so we secretly filmed and went into the house just to see.
Secretly filmed in your glasses, didn't you?
We had glasses, and Neil he needed to know. And we turned up as two tourists who were passing through town. Neil concocted a legend, a story that got us into the house. He was quite good at that. It's his mother. He'll go to any extent to get to the truth. They were there. They invited us in, and we secretly filmed the old man. He approached us with a clear-cut Belgravia accent. He says on secret film that, yes, he was originally from Belgravia. It's the most bizarre bit of secret filming. We made a mistake, as you always do. We had false names, but I called Neil by his real name, and we had there was a schoolboy error, and so we had to get out. But we got out, and we took all of that evidence back to Scotland Yard. COVID hit, then facial recognition, and this thing called AI came storming into our lives. We went through a year of commissioning with one of the big national newspapers, 3 independent AI facial recognition studies, 1 in London, 2 in the US, all by top AI scientists. The one in the US is by former MIT people, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The one in the UK is by Professor Hassan Ugail, top of his game, spotted the FSB spies who did the Salisbury poisonings, preeminent in facial recognition at Bradford University. We had a 3rd study done in London. All 3 studies came back with 87% match or above. 72% is what's accepted. We got 87 on 3 studies. It's him. It's science says it's him, if you believe facial recognition.
That's extraordinary, but I think if I was Lord Lucan, nearly 50 years on, living in hiding in a remote part of Australia, I think at least I'd have shaved off my moustache.
So, Glenn, what happened to the man in Australia?
Well, it was a rollercoaster ride. We had the AI studies, 3 studies saying facial recognition, matching him. Remember, 72% is a match. We had 87%, and 1 came back with 92%. It's him. And as you have to do as a journalist, you've got to go to the person and you've got to put the allegation to them. It's simple. It's basic journalism. Science says, you're Lord Lucan. Are you? Now, we'd been chasing him across Australia for over 2 years. During COVID, he vanished, disappeared from the house in Brisbane. Neil then found him by doing some amazing detective work. So we relocated him, living in another Buddhist commune, way up in the bush, up in northern Australia. And we went to do the doorstep, as we call it. We call it a doorstep. You're knocking on a door. In this case, it was like a massive, great big compound, security cameras, dogs, 5 or 6 young men surrounding him. We went and sat down with him and we said to him, we've got evidence that says you're Lord Lucan. And he doesn't fly off the handle. And this is a man he was 89. He's now 90, so he's 89, but fit. And his young supporters, who were looking after him, his carers, if you like, listened to what we had to say. They were very gentle with Neil, but they said, go away, please. We're not having any of this. Goodbye. He wants you to go. Now, this man had 8 different aliases. We traced his change of name through the Australian courts, where he'd change his name every 7 years by deed poll in Australia. Okay, so you've got to ask a few questions. Why change your name so many times? What's your reason? He also couldn't explain his wealth. We couldn't understand how he lived in what was relative luxury. Anyway, we pushed and pushed and pushed, and eventually his chief carer said, look, Chris, which was the name he was going by then, will sit down and talk to you. And a bizarre interview takes place. You'll see it on the documentary. He gets very irate and very angry. But he gives this snippet of information where he says, I'm not Lord Lucan. I was a dancer, actor in Canada, in Toronto, in the 1960s. And he says it was the 1969 moon landing when I was doing a certain play. And he names the play. So we go back into the records, track the play, find the original director, who now is very elderly himself, but still lives in Toronto, take a photo of the old man in Australia to the theatre director in Toronto, and he says, that's not Chris. I don't know him by that name. And he says, I knew him in 1969 by this name, and gives a totally different name. And we say, are you absolutely sure that these two men are one and the same? And he says, I'm sure. And he names him as a different name and says he was a young actor who appeared in a gay underground revue in 1969. And he says, I'm definitely sure, but I knew him as this name. And that's in the documentary. We include that in the documentary. Neil personally does not accept that. Of course, Neil being Neil does facial recognition on the photo of the young man in 1969. Compares it with the old man in Australia, comes back with a less than 14% match. So Neil's of the opinion, if you believe AI facial recognition, that this is a false witness testimony, that the man in Toronto has got it wrong somehow. So has he got it wrong? Has he got it right? But it's in the documentary. The one thing with this story is you've got to tell it as it is. I'd rather he hadn't surfaced, the man in Toronto. I'd rather that the old man in Australia had said, you've got me, jobs are good and I'm Lord Lucan. But that's not how this story has ended at the moment.
This story has absolutely consumed you for many years, to the extent that a little birdie tells me your dog is named after a certain fugitive.
In fact, my daughters, I've got 3 daughters, and they're so fed up with Dad either writing about Lucan or filming interviews about Lucan, that when we got the dog, they said, look, we can only call him one thing because we want to hear you shouting Lucan, Lucan in the park when he runs off.
Lucan, come back. Lucan, where are you?
And he has a starring role in the documentary series, and Lucan, the dog, gets recognised around town far more than I do.
The enduring question, Glenn, is where did Lucan go? That question remains unanswered. What do you think?
OK, so where did Lucan go? At the moment, where do we stand? At the moment, we stand that AI, facial recognition, says the man in Australia is Richard John Bingham, Lord Lucan, or his identical twin. So that's how it comes down to, OK? That's the probability. Or has AI, facial recognition, got it wrong? Can facial recognition get it wrong? I believe that sometimes there's a 2 to 3% margin of error. And I'm personally convinced that Lord Lucan died in 2008 at a place that I know, not in Africa, but on a continent not too far away. And I base that on the real dying confession of his brother, Hugh Bingham, who told me as much, to the extent where he told me where he was buried. And he described it in such gentle detail. And he did it in front of a witness who I was with, who was a trusted customs and excise investigator with 30 years' experience. I believe that to be the ending. Neil and I still agree to disagree. I find it difficult to swallow the 3 facial recognition studies. I look at AI now and I look at Scotland Yard using it every day, catching criminals. But that's where we are on this story.
And are you continuing the story, Glenn? I'm guessing this isn't the end for you.
We are taking a break. We're lying doggo for a bit. But it's one of those things, Helen, where this story, you don't want it to drive you mad, but you do want it to drive you to justice. And I want to see Neil have resolution for the reason that Martin said earlier on, that Sandra Rivett was a victim of violent crime, and all victims of violent crime deserve justice, sensitivity, understanding, and they deserve people like the police, the dedicated detectives, and also the journalists to an extent, to go and get that justice for them. And for me, Sandra Rivett, the very fact that her memory lives on means that every victim of violent crime, their memory lives on too.
It really has been truly wonderful to have you in the studio. Your knowledge is incredible. This story has taken you all around the world. Your sensitivities to Sandra Rivett, and also your very odd relationship in a way, in the nicest possible way. You're like the odd couple, you and Neil Berriman. I really enjoyed your documentary, and you have a great camaraderie between you. And I know you've done lots of other amazing investigations and continue to do so, but it's been great to have you share the Lucan years and your work. It's been really fascinating, hasn't it?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the level of detail that you've accumulated and how you can draw on it. Sitting here with Helen and I, and every question we've asked you, you've come back with several minutes of very detailed answer. It's astonishing. And I guess you'll keep looking at it, won't you? You're not going to give it up.
No, but one thing I've learnt, Martin, is to wait for the next break. And it'll come, but might be in a week, might be in 5 years. We'll see. The truth's out there, and there are people listening to this who know the truth.
Martin, the Lord Lucan affair is a real-life contemporary thriller, a mix of fact and myth. Is that what makes it so enduring, do you think?
I think there are lots of reasons why we're all continuingly captivated by the Lucan story. Everybody loves a mystery, don't they? We all love to play detective. We're all intrigued by conspiracy theories, and there are a number that you've expounded here, Glenn. I think what this story also does is gives us a glimpse into a world that is so alien to the lives that most of us lead. All of that, I think, would go some way to explaining the enduring myth. And I think also it's a story that captivates fans of true crime, but as I understand it, people who consume true crime also have a sense of justice. And I think that, again, keeps people reading, watching the story, because they want to see justice done for Sandra Rivett's family.
We're left, I think, with a paradox. Officially, Lord Lucan is dead. A death certificate says so. But in our world of true crime, he's very much alive. Until definitive proof emerges of when, where and how John Bingham's life really ended, he lives on. And so does the intrigue.
Some years later, Lady Lucan was asked if she'd like to see her husband again, despite what had happened.
I always hoped to, but I have a feeling that I won't see him again. I don't think he'll come back. He'll have made another life for himself. I always hope, though. There's always a possibility.
Hey listeners, your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.